Okay, this week on the podcast, I am joined by Derrick Emsley, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Veritree, a nature tech company powering verified nature restoration globally. The company has recently announced the closing of its 6.5 million US dollar Series A finance round, while simultaneously hitting its 100 million trees pledged milestone across its projects from Kenya to California to Alberta. So, welcome to the podcast, Derrick.
Thanks for having me here.
But we'll dig into some of those issues in more detail in a minute. But I like to start by asking guests, how did you get started in this line of work?
Yeah, I mean my backstory basically goes back to my first job. So when I was 15 years old, my brother and I started our first company. It was called Greenfield Carbon Offsetters, and we grew up in the prairies, farming, oil and gas, resource country, and it was around the time of early Kyoto Protocol, and we came up with the idea of planting trees on marginal farmland to sell carbon offsets. And we raised a couple $1 million. We built a project. We planted 150,000 trees, and it was a really amazing kind of lens into the world of reforestation and climate. And ultimately wasn't a viable way to fund reforestation at that time, but it really opened our eyes to the world of tree planting. And coming out of that, we decided, we want to plant trees. Like that's what we fell in love with. And so we wanted to figure out a way to fund it. And so we came up with the idea then of starting a consumer brand. That consumer brand became TenTree, which TenTree is an outdoor lifestyle apparel business that plants 10 trees for every product sold, and it's sold in thousands of retailers across the globe. It's funded itself over 100 million trees to be planted over the first 11, 12 years of it being in business. And coming out of that though, and that business still operates today, but we recognized after funding tens of millions worth of reforestation ourselves that we just couldn't audit or verify the work that was happening. And so we started to build a platform to help us do that. And everything from data collection on the ground to geospatial analysis to task management and project management in the field. And we just kept adding more and more to the solution, and that solution ultimately became Veritree. And we spun it out as a standalone business in 2022. And
Mhm.
today we're helping other businesses to invest in high quality restoration themselves.
My first question from that is, how on earth does a couple of teenagers raise millions of dollars to plant trees? You must have been told no quite a few times.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure they were a lot friendlier to us given we just bought our first suits down the street and we're kind of walking into the boardrooms. I we were really fortunate because I think, what we didn't know served us really well at that time. Like we were 15, my brother was 16. We walked into the boardrooms at a number of different organizations, Trans Canada, Sask Energy, Sask Power, a handful of different sort of like large oil and gas and energy companies.
Mhm.
And we just said, hey, we have this idea. We know that this is going to be a problem for you. Will you give us the funding to set up this project as a test? And we surprisingly managed to convince a couple groups to give us the funding, and it was a really incredible experience, kind of for that age, to try to figure out how to connect the dots between an idea and funding and raising that funding and how to actually build the business as a result of it.
Right, that sounds amazing. Now, what was the quid pro quo? What did you have to deliver on uh, in return for that funding?
So this was in the early days of, at the time, the in Canada, a number of the provinces were intending to set up their own cap and trade systems with carbon. So this was 2007, 2008, early Kyoto Protocol, and so what was happening was a lot of these organizations were looking ahead and they were saying, "I'm going to have to buy carbon at a minimum at $15, but based on the forecast, it's going to be north of 100 over the next 10, 15 years." And so what we did was we said, if you plant trees on marginal farmland where that farmland can't really grow much else, the math tells us that we can generate a ton of carbon over the lifetime of that project for, somewhere in the realm of $15 to $20. So basically, you have this big potential liability in the future, and you can fix the price today, very similar to nature-based offtake agreements as they stand today.
Yeah.
And so it was really just, the idea was in early days of what has since become offtake agreements, and our what we had to deliver was offsets.
Hmm. Yeah. And presumably the landowners were the other part of the equation.
Actually, so with the funding from that project, the early funding, we bought the land ourselves. So
Wow.
we were the landowner to that basically was able to establish the land, set up the planting project, prepare the land, everything like that. The land was relatively cheap, given it was at a time where, one, the land in Saskatchewan where we lived was quite undervalued, but two, the land that we were purchasing tended to be pretty ineffective for growing any of the traditional crops in the province.
So the landowners were quite happy to offload it for
Absolutely,
this
yeah.
purpose. Yeah, that sounds interesting. And you mentioned very briefly, but how did this then evolve into the TenTree project? And if you could take us through what it achieved and then the emergence of Veritree on top of that. I know you summarized it earlier on, but perhaps we could dig into a bit more detail.
So the ultimately greenfield carbon offsetters, as it was called, it wasn't viable, just given some of the changes in the regulations for how the offsets were traded amongst provinces, and frankly, just the market didn't evolve the way that we'd anticipated. And so what we came to realize was that just that as a funding vehicle of money up front for a long-term stream of offsets, the confidence wasn't there in where the market was going. So it wasn't a viable way to fund the tree planting efforts that we wanted to do. So what we what we realized was, during that process, how much people loved the tree planting itself. We loved it, and we always knew that. But the excitement that a lot of these organizations and publications and things like that had around this idea of planting trees was really kind of what struck us. And so when we were sort of shutting down or winding up the tree planting farm greenfield carbon offsetters, we said, well, what's a way that we can fund reforestation that kind of leans more into that idea of individuals and consumers, because of that excitement we saw. And that's what led us to the idea of creating a consumer brand. And admittedly, we weren't, none of us were fashion guys. None of us really knew the world of apparel. And in hindsight, there's frankly a lot easier ways to fund tree planting than building an apparel company. But what we did realize early on was that there was something there was this shift that was happening in the world of sort of consumer brands, from people that were buying what we kind of considered aspirational brands that really showed this aspirational lifestyle, to more of this kind of inspirational brands that actually connected you, and you're wearing something that said something about what your values were. And the early days of Tom's shoes, where you could buy one, give a pair of shoes, like that kind of thing.
Mm.
And so we came up with the idea of building a sustainable brand of clothing that would allow people to have an impact on the planet.
Yeah. It seems similar that you bought the land for the trees in the first project, and then in TenTree you launched an apparel company. So it wasn't just providing a service to other brands. You created your own brand
Yeah.
with this tree planting ambition. Just a matter of interest, what sort of apparel were you selling?
So I think the best kind of comparison, which is a pretty well-known one, would be like Patagonia.
Right.
We kind of consider it sort of Patagonia light. It's outdoor lifestyle apparel versus hardcore outdoor apparel. We like to think of it. And there's this amazing quote, I think it's by David Attenborough, where he says, people won't protect what they don't care about, and they don't care about what they haven't experienced. And so for us, it was all about building the apparel and the lifestyle around that apparel, about getting outdoors, being in nature, experiencing out like wild places, and in doing so, falling in love with nature and wanting to protect it.
Hmm. Yeah. And yeah, you can see the obvious connection between people who'd be buying that sort of clothing and the natural world. And and what's the progress to date then overall?
So with so at TenTree, we built a brand that's sold in thousands of retailers across the world. We've sold well over 10 million units of apparel since we started it back in 2012. We've funded tens of millions of dollars worth of reforestation as a result, and ultimately planted over 100 million trees to date. In addition to that, we're one of the top 5% of B Corps globally.
Hmm.
There's an organization called the Textile Exchange that measures the sort of forward lookingness of an organization based on the fibers and materials that it uses, and we're one of the top 10 brands globally on that list. So really, it's been this evolution. It didn't happen overnight, but really the goal has been to build a vehicle that allows us to fund tree planting. But in doing so, we've also looked to try to build a really amazing and sustainable product as the vehicle to do that. And so it's been really a journey in learning about how to implement high quality supply chains, sustainable materials, circular supply chains as well. Looking at net zero, we've offset for TenTree. We've measured, reduced, and offset our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions as a business, B Corp, things like that as well.
Yeah. So what is it when you talk about the circular economy? Is this recycling the fabrics back into apparel or back into other uses?
Depends on the product itself, but we've implemented a take back program with our consumers and with a number of our retailers as well, where people can return both our apparel as well as others. And then there's, what ends up happening is that product can either be resold, if it's viable to be resold, or if it's not, it can be recycled. And so what that can mean in some cases is the fabric then gets broken down in a way to be used again for clothing,
Mhm.
or it means it's used for something else altogether. So it could be things like rags, it could be, other sort of use cases.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. And then Veritree emerged to sell carbon credits on a wider scale, not just being associated with apparel.
So to me, the way I think about the journey was we started with a tree farm. TenTree allowed us to fund thousands of tree farms. Veritree allows us to create thousands of TenTrees. And so for us, we were funding millions and millions of dollars worth of reforestation. And the challenge is we were lucky if we got more than a Google photo album to support the planting
Mm.
and the story of how it happened. And oftentimes we would travel to these locations to do our own diligence, to audit the work that had happened. And we were challenged to actually be able to know, are we looking at the right photo? Are we standing in the right spot? Are we really seeing the work that's happened here that we funded? And there's this kind of running joke in tree planting of, one tree gets funded a million times, and like who knows, right?
Yeah.
And so with the idea with Veritree was we were pushing our partners for more and more transparency and more auditability and verification, and they just couldn't provide it. And not for lack of good intention, just they were good at tree planting in a lot of cases, and didn't necessarily have the additional bandwidth or expertise to build something to allow to support the auditability. And so we started to build these tools over the course of a couple of years at TenTree. Everything from we started with data collection
Mhm.
applications. We then moved into more monitoring and verification applications. And then ultimately we work towards a full project management suite of a restoration projects. And then that became Veritree. And really the intent was never to roll Veritree out as a standalone business, but we started getting approached by other businesses that were investing and supporting reforestation efforts. And you mentioned carbon. Carbon is just one of those vehicles. And in fact, it tends to be the smaller of the vehicles. There's right now there's billions of dollars going into restoration work, and and a fraction of that is a result of carbon. There's more that's happening in restoration because of CSR and philanthropic efforts. There's more because of biodiversity investments, more because of reclamation and remediation efforts than there is because of carbon. And so for us, we weren't so myopic as to say carbon is the only way to fund this, because also TenTree wasn't built for that purpose. So we started working with a number of these organizations that had different use cases, but wanted to know that if they were funding reforestation, it was truly happening. And we spun Veritree out as a standalone business in 2022. And today we have as many as 20,000 businesses that we're supporting through Veritree, where it took us about 11 years to plant 100 million trees with TenTree. And you mentioned it at the beginning, but it's taken us just about 3 years to reach that 100 million tree mark with Veritree.
Right, right. But is there any tension then between biodiversity ambitions and carbon ambitions? I'm sitting here in the north of England, where near one of Europe's biggest forests, which is almost entirely fast growing evergreens grown for timber rather than any biodiversity, and it's sometimes regarded as a bit of a biodiversity desert, even though there are a lot of trees. So, how do you manage those two sometimes competing ambitions?
So we don't think about it as tree planting. We think about it as restoration. And to us, restoration is sort of the marrying of tree planting and a high quality forest ecosystem. So for us, there's and admittedly, like TenTree is lives into this, but the idea of just planting a tree is a dramatic oversimplification about what creating a forest is. And but us as consumers, us as individuals, we tend to have this emotional connection to a tree, and frankly, we like simple messages. And so the idea of planting a tree resonates, but at the end of the day, what you want is the forest. And carbon is just one of the benefits of that forest. It's biodiversity, there's socioeconomic impacts in a lot of countries, there's all these additional things. And so for us, the question is how do you connect the dots from the input to the outcomes? And how do you build a project appropriately to drive those outcomes? We don't look to do forests and or tree planting efforts and afforestation that is sort of monoculture, purely focused on carbon, because in a lot of cases that's not an appropriate way to restore nature. It's a way to get to a singular outcome if carbon is all you care about. But real restoration has to be done in a way that is meant to lift biodiversity, lift all these other things that, frankly, it's meant to be as if the forest had existed there without any human intervention altogether.
But I suppose measuring carbon's relatively simple. I was going to say simple, but it's not relatively simple. But measuring the restoration of nature, you've got lots of variables, and some of which, as I say, may or may not conflict at times. So, in terms of verifiable credits that you can sell, how do you provide that reassurance in those credits and the verification that you were talking about before?
So I think going back to how we fund restoration is not purely carbon.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first point is carbon itself is a way to fund reforestation. It is not the only way to fund restoration. If you look at the market, there's a report a number of years back by the UN on the state of finance and nature, and it talked about all these different funding streams. And if you looked at it, actually, the biodiversity market and there's a lot that's basketed within that. There are things like, remediation efforts and stuff like that. But that market was, 10 times the size of the carbon market
Right.
at the time. Like today, I think nature-based carbon was thought to have maybe peaked at about 2 billion a year, and it's maybe a quarter of that today. Whereas a number of these other markets, whether it be nature bonds, whether it be biodiversity markets and remediation, like these are sort of different financing vehicles that are focused on what you're talking about, an understanding of nature and an understanding that carbon is not necessarily just an oversimplification, but it's maybe a just focus on one of the outcomes rather than the holistic outcome, and a different vehicle for funding that. So for us as an organization, and so I think this is important, is when it comes to Veritree and how we fund reforestation, carbon is a very small portion of that.
Yeah. But it's still this complex. But that complexity is what I was asking about. Was that if you're taking the holistic view, and this, there's always been a big tension in my head about if you don't put a value on nature, then people tend to value it as zero in financial decisions. If you do put a value on it, how do you encapsulate that value? And the cliche is, how do you put a price on the last leopard? So if you're starting to trade in nature, there's always going to be compromises. And I'm just trying to get a feel for how you manage that complexity, so that you're getting a usable valuation of the restoration you're doing in financial terms.
Yeah. I think the point that is really important is that the value of nature is complex, and the idea of, like, there is not today a unit of biodiversity. The idea of a unit of carbon is a easier, to your point, what thing to measure, and something that in a lot of cases we've all anchored to. For us, the way we look at a project is we say, because we often we tend to work in the world of restoration, not necessarily protection is a part of it, because when it comes to restoration, there tends to be components of that ecosystem that also need to be protected and preserved as a result of it. But what we look at is we say, what will be the cost over the next 15 to 25 years to protect or to restore this forest to a point where it wouldn't have been degraded to begin with? And inclusive of that is all the education and work that needs to happen to ensure that it actually stands the test of time thereafter. Inclusive of that are the things around, like, does it become a biodiverse forest? So we take all those costs, and then the way that we tend to work with organizations in a lot of cases is we help them package up these investments in ways that make sense for their business. So carbon could be a vehicle to fund it for an organization if they have the budget and the desire to move forward with carbon offsets. But I would say that there's a very small subsegment of carbon buyers today that are willing to put money into a project up front with the sort of that will deliver offsets over a 25-year lifespan. That's it. That's a very sophisticated carbon buyer. And then, I think there's this running joke within some of the carbon firms where it's like, you're not looking for product market fit, you're looking for product Microsoft fit. in a lot of cases, because it really is. There's a couple buyers. So what we've also done is we found ways to take that investment and accelerate and package it up into different ways businesses can see value. And so we work with organizations that have CSR budgets that are often several times the size of their carbon budgets. And the idea of planting a tree or restoring a forest or a space within a forest, if we can take that overall investment and package it down into different types of units, like a restoration unit of some sort for that forest. It could be a tree, it could be a area like a hectare of restoration, it could be something else, and package it up in a way where it actually allows them to invest and create some sort of ROI positive outcome within their business,
Hmm.
whether it be, consumer interaction or brand building or something like that. Then as well, we're able to fund these in different ways. So I would say I think you're right in the sense that we need a way to sustainably fund and put a price on nature. And right now, the approach with carbon tends to be an oversimplification. There isn't a clear cut solution from a biodiversity standpoint yet. So it tends to be a kind of mixture of approaches that's needed.
Hmm. Yeah, I've got some scars on my back from a long time ago, 20 years ago, being on the board of a regional carbon offsetting project, which included tree planting. And part of the problem we had was, or the main problem that it closed down was that the press scrutiny of offsetting schemes was either determined to find problems or found problems. And, periodically there'll be an expose in one of the newspapers about whether we'll take, I know we're talking about wider than carbon, but for the sake of simplicity, let's talk about the carbon markets. And and saying, even under some of the best quality approval verification schemes, a lot of carbon credits were considered or they claimed were worthless. So, how do you overcome that both in, I suppose, practical sense and in terms of a sort of reputational sense for the whole sort of nature markets?
Well, I think that so there's a bunch of layers to that question. I think what you're highlighting though is part of what's broken in general about the carbon system.
Mhm.
Is we've given ourselves millions of reasons not to do it rather than a couple reasons to do it. And so we think this idea of pricing carbon is going to be one of the silver bullets, because then we have a vehicle to fund all this work. But there's a reason today that more money is flowing into direct air capture than which will ultimately cost $1,000 a ton, than restoration efforts, which could cost a fraction of that.
Mhm.
And that you could 10x the investment on the nature-based investment, truly make it a like investable asset with everything from insurance products to all these other things. But instead the money is all flowing into these areas because there's certainty. And it's interesting because we're at this point in within the our what we need to do with climate change, where we're already far behind. This is not a perfection market that we need right now. We need a progress oriented market. And unfortunately, whether it be from a press perspective or from a the hundreds of standards and registries and complexity perspective, we're building a system that is frankly it's far too fragile, and it won't ever end up like delivering the outcome in a reasonable amount of time. And so, even when you look at externally, as things like AI are, accelerating our energy needs dramatically, and as a result, seeing new plants getting fired up and things like that to support some of this work, we're falling further and further behind. And as a result, and then at the same time, the infrastructure, how we built this carbon market is making it harder and harder to get good projects off the ground. So I think that's just more of a commentary on the system as a whole, which I think in a lot of cases overemphasizes things like permanence and things like 100% proof, and basically the idea, because everybody's avoiding egg on face, and so we just don't even get off the starting line. And as for us with Veritree, I think our approach has generally been to say, like, what we're trying to build is the system to make nature investable. We're trying to build the system that when I mentioned before the input and connect it to the outcome, what we're trying to do is really build the system that provides real-time, ongoing verification, measurability, and auditability through that life cycle. And a lot of the solutions in nature are very much focused on things like geospatial, which, just like the carbon measurement side of things, is a bit of an oversimplification when all of the success of that project happens in the first 2 to 3 years, when a lot of the geospatial work doesn't really help that much. And so for us, it's really been about creating the ground-based data collection, monitoring, and measurement systems, weaving in all the necessary geospatial and measurement tools that exist to build a platform that allows us to see, monitor, and measure, and ultimately celebrate the impact that these projects can have.
Yeah. I suppose the question is how big an impact can projects like this have? Do you have any idea of what the potential in terms of tackling climate change are? Because obviously, nature restoration requires land. Land is under pressure from agriculture and other uses. And do we have a feel for the size of the prize? Or maybe if that's too big a question, because we were talking about globally in different ecological zones and whatnot, but what you believe as an organization, the size of the prize in terms of, let's say, carbon is?
So generally speaking, the nature-based solutions, the world of nature-based solutions is considered to be one of these sort of gigaton scale opportunities that we have, where as much as a third of the global carbon removal by 2050 could happen through nature-based solutions. And so for us, it is, if not the largest, one of the most important tools in our toolkit as far as carbon removal over the next 30 years.
Yeah. And then just thinking about your, Kenya, California, and Alberta, when I mentioned sort of ecological zones, climate zones, presumably you have to closely tailor the project to each of those zones. And from what you're saying, I guess you're working out what would have been there pre-civilization and trying to restore. Is that the model?
Yeah, so I think the way that we look at it is every project, whether it be mangroves in Eastern Africa, post-wildfire in North America, or rainforests in the deforested rainforest in the Amazon. Mm-hmm. All these projects kind of follow a similar workflow, which is to say, assess the opportunity. And what that means in a lot of cases is, understand the risks, understand the impacts, understand what would have been there without any human intervention or environmental intervention, and understand if human intervention to restore it is actually even necessary. Mm-hmm. And then from there, assess the opportunity, you move to project design, where you want to design a high quality project that delivers both carbon and biodiversity benefits. Then you move to implementation, Then you move to the verification of that ground level work and the monitoring, the immediate monitoring of it.
Hmm.
And then you move to the long term monitoring and reporting. And so, like, every project follows kind of those five sort of baskets of work. And every ecosystem, though, requires a very different approach. So it's really about our system really is about managing that workflow, but then tailoring through, modularization to every one of those individual ecosystems. So, for instance, we have a functionality within our system where we call it smart design. But basically, what it helps us do is it helps us take the project design and then really grid it out into an implementation plan around different levels of intervention, sensor deployments, things like that. How that smart design looks in a mangrove restoration site versus a Canadian wildfire restoration site are dramatically different. And so it's really about tailoring the system to each of these different ecosystems.
Yeah. Yeah, I assume that would be the answer, I suppose. But the other major criticism that's always flung at offsetting schemes is that in terms of the people buying the credits, that it permits them to do nothing. Now, I have my own views on that, which I'll come out in a minute, but I thought I'd throw that one at you first. How do you respond to those criticisms? Is that people can just buy a few credits and then carry on polluting?
So I think it is a so I think you have to look at sort of what is the counterfactual to that, which is, for to not do carbon offsetting at all, there's an assumption that there's an alternative that is better. And I think we can all sort of hypothesize that it would be great if these emitters just stopped altogether, but that's not reality. I think, like, a great example of this, and we see this in Canada every day. Canada is one of the most resource rich countries in the world. And in a lot of cases, from a carbon intensity of our grid, we are living in the future. If you look at the United States, I think they emit something like 350 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour and in the best case scenarios, they'll cut that in half in the next 30 years.
Mm.
Canada's living at about 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour because we have hydro, geothermal, all these incredible things. But we also have incredible oil resources and natural resources around potash and things like that. In a lot of cases, we haven't been able to extract that or monetize that, and we can do it in a cleaner way than a lot of other countries. But we continue to, and so we have kind of stopped ourselves from actually taking out these natural resources because we believe that they shouldn't be done, that this shouldn't be done. The reality is the world goes on. They buy it somewhere else, somewhere that's dirtier, somewhere that's not going to take it out of the ground as well as we could have. And I think I kind of connect that to carbon offsetting in a lot of ways, which is to say the world is going to move forward with or without our approach to carbon offsetting. And right now, we don't necessarily have a better solution to the idea of trying to peg something to climate that a company can actually create some sort of activity around, and a way to fund these other projects in a significant sized way. Like, the whole world of direct air capture would not exist today if it was not for us believing that carbon offsetting was a viable market. So I think, if nothing else, whether it's perfect today or not, just the market signals and the buying signals it can create to actually spur innovation for the future is a massive, massive, step in the right direction. But it's absolutely not perfect. I get that. But I think the idea that it's it lets people emit or something like that, to me, that is an oversimplification and a living in sort of a world where that isn't reality.
Yeah. Although it is said that, obviously we've got this wide range of prices of carbon credits, with direct air DIC being at the top level, $1,000 a ton. But tree planting tends to be right down at the the other end, a few dollars per ton of carbon. And some estimations are that the carbon credit price would need to certainly come off that lower end of the range in order to start driving change within the companies, that offsetting becomes more expensive than taking action internally, if you see what I mean. If credits are too cheap, then it is an alternative to maybe a more difficult investment decision within the company.
And like I said, like carbon is like the market for carbon is not perfect. But it's the best, one of the best vehicles we have right now to sort of drive some of this change. But I completely agree. I think like direct air capture is far too expensive for the vast majority of organizations, which is why you really only see the you know tech companies investing in it. On the flip side, nature, in a lot of cases, in crappy offsets, it's kind of like spurred this market of sort of like junk offsets in some ways because of that. So there definitely needs to be the market is not perfect, and there needs to be some significant change for it to actually deliver the outcomes that we need. But for us to think that there would be a better market that we could spin up right now that would drive all the change of and that would be significantly better and wouldn't have its own challenges. I just think we're better building around and shoring up the system that there's already some general appetite around globally than trying to think of a completely new global mechanism that can drive change.
Yeah. Now, obviously, south of the border from you, the Trump administration starting to take a more proactively anti-climate approach than they did before. It was a bit we will do nothing in the first Trump um, uh, presidency. In Canada, you have a largely climate friendly prime minister just elected. Somebody used to be run our Bank of England here, but did those political and I don't want to drag you into a partisan political argument, but do those sort of political movements, does that buffet the market as well? Do you see companies maybe taking a step back, US companies, or maybe the whole elbows up approach of Mark Carney make Canadian businesses more keen to take action? How is that working out in practice?
I think from our perspective, so our business is pretty international at Veritree. So we have, a solid component of our partners that are Canadian, a really good component that are US, but also an equally sized component that's international. And so we're not necessarily seeing a massive swing from our business. I think what we are seeing is that there's a lot of organizations that are talking about their commitments less. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're not doing them altogether or that they're putting them on pause. But what we are seeing is that whole like shift from green washing to green hushing that's tending to happen. And so organizations, I think in a lot of cases, are anticipating that this is a moment in time, and every 4 years in the United States, you gotta swim with whatever way the water is going, and they're not necessarily anticipating that this is a full systemic shift. They're viewing it as a moment in time, and a lot of things continue to move forward even if they aren't talking about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's the case in a lot of things. Look at investments in clean technology, clean energy, and things in the US. It certainly wasn't hit by the first Trump administration, and there seems to be a reluctance to commit to high carbon in
Yeah.
case everything changes again.
Well, I think you even see it, frankly, we've seen it in the venture funding space, which I often kind of look at as sort of this this world that tries to underwrite the future, and climate investors historically kind of had these different theses around what were the big areas that of climate that had a large enough addressable market that there was billion-dollar outcomes that could happen within. And so they would underwrite a few deals in nature, underwrite a few deals in solar, and a few of these others. And what you often see is a lot of these climate VCs have transitioned the vast majority of their investments to just energy transition is what it has become. And so I think like that's a bit of like a rebranding to some extent that tends to happen of, global warming to climate change to energy transition to this and that. So I kind of see this as just a natural evolution.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I've taken up quite a bit of your time, and thanks for that and all your insights. I'm just wondering, obviously you've been at this for quite a while, going back to those teenage days of having a vision, I suppose. And you've summarized a little bit of this, but if you went back to your teenage self starting out, what advice would you give yourself?
um, I would. I think what I would say is that, and I think this is particularly relevant in the climate space and aligned with a number of the points you brought up, but we have this view internally that integrity compounds. And I think for us, what that means is that the world of climate is a missionary, not mercenary world. And you see the world of like the carbon cowboys and things like that that come in and look to make money off of like a potential market that's developing, then it's not, then it's developing and it's not. And you see the damage in a lot of cases, particularly from a nature-based perspective, that can do both to the market and to frankly like the people that are trying to do really good work. So for us, and I think it would be about saying like the focus on doing the right thing over and over and over again, even when that decision is hard, because it's the hard and slow and kind of messy work of building trust over not just months or years, but decades that is really going to create this market and help it evolve to where we believe it needs to be to really play a significant role within our climate work.
Yeah, excellent. And I suppose I said that was going to be the final question, but I'll ask another one. Is there any particular project, um, whether it's a practical project or some other achievement that you're particularly proud of? Is there one that gives you a warm glow inside every time you think about it?
I think we one of my favorite projects. I mean we've been so fortunate. We've seen the impact of reforestation all across the globe. We've also gotten it wrong a lot. So when we do actually get something right, it and when we've started to see that happen more and more and more, it's really special. I think one of the projects that to us is really impactful, and we're doing a lot of mangrove restoration work, but it was actually an area where it was, call it 1,000 hectares or so of opportunity where we did a significant set of restoration over about 3 to 4 years. And we're still doing quite a bit of ongoing work there. But one of the things was that, as these projects evolve, you go from helping support the community with a lot of reforestation work to, the need for protection and ongoing maintenance tends to be less than the mass planting. And so what we've done is we've actually rolled out, hundreds of beehives throughout a number of areas of this forest. And those beehives now are producing more funding for the communities and the surrounding sort of impacted communities than the tree planting at its peak ever was. And those beehives are thriving in part because of the forest as it's coming back and the growth. And the beehives are supporting the ecosystem in a really incredible way. And I guess supposedly helping protect it, I'm sure too, because there's a lot of bees floating around in certain areas. But seeing the impact that has had on some of the sort of forest adjusted communities and the adjacent areas, and seeing like hundreds of families that have been impacted positively as a result of that work is pretty special.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine because it was a, I suppose a question I didn't ask was about, local communities and working with that. But the ideal, I think, as you've explained, is if they benefit more post-project than pre-project, then you've got a wonderful win-win situation.
I mean, that's how it has to be. I think you have to create, like, the world runs on incentives, and the forest, just, you alluded to this before, is like, how do we price, how do we make a forest standing worth more than a forest down? And that's not just to the company that wants to buy the offset, that's to the local communities, because a lot of these areas, like, these forests aren't cut down because people don't like nature. They're trying to support their families in a lot of
Mm.
cases.
Yeah, fantastic. Right. Well, thank you very much, Derek. I find that fascinating, and I'll find it even more fascinating when I listen to it back. But thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Gareth. Appreciate you having me.